Okay, I think I begin, and maybe we'll have some latecomers, so they would be welcome later. A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for making time to come to the first event in a way that we are starting today. I also thank you on behalf of Brookings India and our chairman, Mr. Vikram Mehta, who is also with us today. So I think we have, since this is a very special subject, the audience is obviously select audience. We are expecting 5 more people, but I don't think I should wait, and I begin. What we have started at Brookings India under one of its verticals, like there are 3 verticals. One is development, gender, and other issues. The second one is foreign policy. The third one is natural resources, energy, minerals. While we were working on coal and natural gas and oil, the new element that we have introduced as a sub-vertical maybe, the non-fuel minerals and mining in India. So this is a new program of work that we have started, and we have invited Mr. Tom Mills. I've given myself only 5 minutes, so I won't take more than that in welcoming and introducing, and then I'll hand it over to Tom. And we also are privileged to have Mr. Arun Kumar, former Secretary Mines, as discussant for the day. Just to introduce in a couple of minutes the program, what we have, sorry about it, people might, sorry. You see, in the program on non-fuel minerals and mining in India, we have 3 major components that we are considering. The first one is the efficiency and the best possible way that the companies can work in India on all aspects, starting from exploration to the final delivery, production, extraction. The second one being the normative part, that is the externalities that are generated or have been generated are taken care of, whether it is in terms of environment or in terms of local communities getting affected. The third thing that we are going to do is learning from the international good practices, so that these 3 components complete the study on the efficiency levels, the exploration, etc., and moving to the mining. Second is the normative aspects, and the third one is learning from the international good practices. What we have already been able to do is to create the new input-output table for India for 2015-16. We have also participated in the Niti Aayog discussions on the vision document they are preparing for 2035. We have also been working on sustainable mining jurisdictions, and the papers are going to be out one by one. Input-output paper is already out. Exploration issues are also being worked by one of our colleagues, Biplab Chatterjee. Finally, what I think I would end with is that we are thinking of doing a major annual report on Brookings India State Mining Attractiveness Index. So we would be looking at the mining practices from all its angles, all perspectives, and create a report called the Sustainable State Mining Attractiveness Index. This much about the program. I think the brochure we have distributed for it. The lecture that or seminar that we are going to hear from Tom talks about, and that he will be soon talking about, 4 aspects that he's going to discuss. What are the economic characteristics of the mining industry and why it is unique? What risks and challenges does the mining industry present to economic development? How can the mining industry make an economic contribution? So that's much of it that is we are working on. And what global trends will impact upon the development of India's mining sector? So these are the 4 aspects that, Tom, you would be discussing in your presentation. And I think I'll do a brief introduction, because without that, it may not be fair to move to the presentation. Mr. Tom Mills is Director and Head of Research at Two Oceans Strategy, a natural resource-focused risk, sustainability and research consultancy in UK. He has dedicated his career to understanding the intersection between politics, society, and economics in natural resource and energy industries. He has worked in the mining and energy sectors, both in industry and as a governance advisor. He is a regular contributor to the Extractive Industries and Societies Journal and other peer-reviewed publications. Tom has delivered multi-million pound consultancy, development and research projects related to governance, geo-economics and political economy of natural resource industries for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank, ADB, DFID, and a range of other investors. He holds a master's degree in political science, political and social science from Oxford University, and a natural resource focused MBA from University of Dundee. Welcome, Tom, to today's seminar. And most of us know about Mr. Arun Kumar, but I would like to introduce him before I give it to Tom. Mr. Arun Kumar is from the Indian Administrative Service. He was the secretary to the Ministry of Mines during 2017-18, where he oversaw amendments to the Mining Auction Rules 2018 and the launch of Aeromagnetic Exploration Surveys of India. He was the chairman of the Sand Mining Committee, which released the Sand Mining Framework in 2018. He had an earlier stint at the Ministry of Mines as Joint Secretary 2012-2015, 3 years, more than 3 years in fact. He presided over the Mines Tribunal under the Mines and Minerals Development and Regulation Act 1957, which came into being in 2015. He also assisted in making amendments to MMDR Act in 2015. He was on the board of National Aluminium Company NALCO, Hindustan Copper Limited HCL, and Mineral Exploration Company Limited MECL. After 3 semesters at IIT Delhi, he left to do a mechanical engineering degree and an electrical engineering degree from the Indian Institute of Railway Mechanical and Electrical Engineers and a postgraduate degree in economics from Annamalai University. So he knows engineering as well as economics. He is currently an independent director on the board of Petronet LNG Limited. He is also a management advisor and arbitrator. Warm welcome to you, Mr. Arun Kumar, to this afternoon. Over to you, Tom. Take care of height and the ceiling.
Firstly, thank you very much for having me to speak here today. It's a great honour to be on stage with former Secretary Kumar and also Professor Chadha. It's also fantastic to be in a room with such a brain trust. And I greatly look forward to the discussion after the talk, in which I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot. The Brookings Institute was actually the first institution in the world to run a lecture series on mineral economics back in the 1930s, subsequently followed by Penn and Columbia. And as such, it's a great privilege to be part of that tradition.
Hello again.
Mining and metals have an essential contribution to play to society. Many eras in humanity's past have been named after them. The Stone Age, the Iron Age, the Bronze Age, the Copper Age, Coal, Petro Age, all ages of society. The information age is dependent upon the products of this industry. No more so now that when we're looking at a threat to our planet from climate change, with mining an essential conduit of the inputs into this green transition. This conversation is also incredibly timely. The National Minerals Policy declares an aspiration to double production of mineral products over the next 7 years. And as a country, there's an aspiration to achieve a $5 trillion economy by the middle of the decade. Before I start, I've got to caveat this discussion by stating that I'm not a geologist or an engineer or an environmental scientist. And this discussion is going to focus heavily on economics, social and political sciences. And also, it will come from a position of the private sector, as I've had quite limited engagement with state-owned enterprises. So if there are any people here from those backgrounds, it would be wonderful to hear from you during the discussion. So I don't want to go over what has already been said, but I first, rather selfishly, have put up a slide of my favourite mine. So this is the Diavik mine, and if there's such things, a mine can be called such things, I think this is probably the prettiest mine in the world. Now the reason I've done this is because this mine, which requires an extensive amount of engineering and geological expertise to exploit these 4 kimberlite pipes that go down into the Lake de Grasse in northern Canada, also sums up a lot of the challenges we have around creating economic linkages within the sector. So firstly, I'd like to turn to look at laying a foundation of some of the key economic characteristics of the mining industry. I'll explain a bit about production, the market, the industrial strategy, the key stakeholders and evolving interactions, moving on to the mine life cycle, and also the shifts in risks and reward throughout the life of these projects. So first of all, as we all know, mining is fundamentally an economic activity. It produces the vital commodities which are our foundation minerals for an increasing quality of life. And at this economic output level, it is a function of land, which in this case is mineral deposits, which are typically, they are unknown. There's an unknown geological endowment until we explore them. They're geographically fixed. They cannot be moved around the world for changing policy or changing regimes. They are finite. Although we don't know what is contained within the ground until it's mined out, these resources will come to an end. If we look at labour, there's a requirement within this industry for highly skilled and unskilled labour. And we'll come on to talk about Industry 4.0 as part of the trends which are having an impact upon that. Capital. This is a highly capital-intensive industry, as we all know, requiring to generate the scale and scope to decrease our costs. Additionally, there's large environmental social impact, and it's extremely long-term. There's one mine, the Garenberg mine, which has been operating since the 14th century, with only a couple of decades stoppaging during the last century. So we know the products are fungible. They are traded on an international marketplace, whether that's the London Metal Exchange, whether that's the Shanghai Futures Exchange. And these price cycles are volatile. Due to the fungible nature of the products, the industry is a price taker. Unlike consumer electricals, whereby you can produce a better quality of good or a different quality of good, in mining you are taking the price and competing on the costs, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to show this copper cost curve from 2015, with the orange line being the price and these blue columns denoting both the cost of production and the capital costs, and the difference between these two being the economic rent that can be generated. In mineral economics, typically in the long run, the price of a mineral will go back to the average marginal cost of production. Therefore, in order to be competitive, you need to be operating in the lowest ways of this cost curve. There's been some interesting developments since the commodity super cycle, which really peaked in 2011. We've seen a global convergence around strategy, looking at increasing operational efficiency, decreasing costs, creating economies of scale and scope, all focused on decreasing the marginal cost of production. However, that's been at the expense of this orange line here, which is early stage greenfield exploration. And at the moment, we're seeing a tightening of the pipeline of potential high-grade deposits which are going to come on to the market going forward. In contrast, we see further exploration around existing mines. And I wanted to put this up here because it demonstrates a real opportunity for India. Typically, exploration over the past period of time has been in OECD countries, and India presents a very large opportunity to buck this trend. The industry touches a myriad number of stakeholders. The government, which is a policy developer, investment facilitator and regulator. investors, contractors and suppliers, service providers, indigenous communities and their organisations, mining affected communities, civil society organisations, organised labour, academia and research institutions such as this one, current and future citizens and media. And I wanted to put up this diagram on the left-hand side here, or right-hand side if you're looking at over there. And what this shows is the thickness of those lines that are connecting the various stakeholder groups demonstrate the influence between these groups. The size of these bubbles show the total influence, and the colour demonstrates whether that influence is internal within the stakeholder groups or external. And this study shows some quite interesting findings. First of all, globally, there's no dominant influencer in this stakeholder group at an international level shaping attitudes to the sector. Also, influence is often endemic, contained within the peer group, and we see this heavily with the NGO community, which is very dark blue, NGOs influencing other NGOs, but maybe having less of an influence over some of the other sectors. And these findings are in line with some of the potential to generate adversarial relationships between a number of these stakeholder groups, which we've seen historically in the sector. So if we look now towards the mine life cycle, there are some very distinct phases throughout the life of a mining project. First of all, we have a permitting and exploration phase, which, as we can see, results in quite limited labour. And this is a stage where typically the junior exploration sector or the junior mining sector is looking to prove up the geology and economic viability of a resource. And this is a stage where there is extremely high risk. Typically 1 in 200 or 1 in 200, 1 in 200 or 1 in 300 projects which are listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange or the Vancouver Stock Exchange actually become mining projects. Then we move into the construction phase where we see this large spike in labour requirement, and that's when we typically see a transition of licence from the junior sector to the majors. Subsequent to this, we see revenue starting during the operation phase, a couple of years of ramp up, and then this operation phase until finally closure and decommissioning, and then post-closure. We see this drop in labour at the operation phase, which is something we're going to come on to in the next section of the talk. But also one thing that I find very interesting that was produced by an economist called Vernon in 1971 was around the shifts in power dynamics between the various different stakeholders over this life cycle. Prior to a company investing heavily in a company will have the technology, the management and the capital that's required by that country, and it will therefore have the power. But once it's invested and developed a project within that country, we see the power typically shifting back towards the government. And that's sometimes when we see renegotiations of contracts. So having just run a baseline around the economic characteristics of the sector, I'm just going to run you through some of the challenges to this concept of mining as a potential for economic development, then look at how the resource cost hypothesis has been updated over the last decade, and also look at some of the international standards and initiatives around governance. So in the 1970s, a number of economists, namely Nankani, Orty and Gelb, started looking at the relationship between GDP and mineral dependence. And they started putting together some case study analysis that suggested a negative relationship between this dependence and GDP. The seminal work was produced by Jeffrey Sachs, who was a special advisor on the Sustainable Development Goals to the UN, and Andrew Warner, principally in 1995, in which they studied 97 countries on a time series between 1971 and 1989, and they identified a negative trend using econometric analysis. These commentators argue that this is the reason for this is threefold. Firstly, external market forces. Secondly, internal economic stresses. And thirdly, these challenges around policy making that the industry presents. So in terms of external market forces, there's been an argument to suggest that having a large mineral dependence will impact upon the terms of trade. There's something called the Krebs-Singer hypothesis, which posits that the world's economy will grow, but the demand for minerals will not grow at a commensurate pace, and therefore its corresponding value will decrease, and also that the price of minerals, due to technology and operational efficiency, will decrease over this time. And we see this with the experience of Australia over the past century. Australia has around 70 to 80% dependence on mineral exports, and they import around 70 to 80% manufactured goods, and their terms of trade declined from 130 to 100 over the course of the last century. Additionally, yoking an economy to a volatile mineral price has also been seen to be very challenging. Unpredictable and lumpy revenues make public financial management quite difficult. Additionally, internal economic stresses. We see the experience of Holland in the 1970s, where the economist coined a term called Dutch disease, which is related to the uncomfortable coexistence of booming and lagging sectors. And here we see the red line, which is the production of oil after the oil boom in the early 1970s, and then the green line being manufacturing. This oil boom increased the Dutch gelder at the time, which made manufacturing, domestic manufacturing and agriculture uneconomic. And we see this slump in the green line here, and this slight downward curve in GDP in the early 80s. Also, there's some challenges around policy making. There have been a number of highly mineral dependent countries that have excessive rent seeking and misuse, and also there's been an argument to have a trend around the more dependent you are on minerals, the greater the corruption in the country. Also, due to the finite nature and the challenges around financial management of a volatile currency, of a volatile revenue source, there are suggestions that there's also an undeveloped institutional framework. However, these arguments have been revisited over the past decade by people such as Professor Davies at the School of Mines in Colorado. And they argue that actually, yes, if you look at a specific time series, there may be a negative relationship between these two vectors. However, when you start to look at a wider time series, this relationship starts to change. And the longer the time series you have, the more positive that relationship becomes. So if you look at it over a century, actually there's a positive relationship between mineral dependence and GDP. He argues that no economic activity is assured a long-term future. Financial planning and good governance will manage those risks. And also that the economic benefits of these projects outweigh the risks. And when we start to look at it on a human development index point of view, actually we see that mining companies, as measured by the Mining Contribution Index, which is a UN contribution index, have a higher improvement in HDI than non-mining countries. So just turning to some of the thinking that's been done around good governance and transparency in order to manage the downside risks. And this is just this is the basis of a piece of work conducted by the Natural Resource Governance Institute, a think tank based between London and New York, where they've looked at the mine life and suggested a number of key facets within that. And I'm not going to go through them all, but I'll read out the headlines from a few of them. So under Precept 1, it suggests that resource management should secure the greatest benefit for citizens through an inclusive and comprehensive national strategy, clear legal framework and competent institutions. Under Precept 3, it talks about encouragement of efficient exploration and production operations, including transparent rights. Precept 4 is looking at tax and contractual provisions which should enable the government to realise the full value of its resource consistent with attracting investment and robust to changing circumstances. The government, Precept 5, the government should pursue opportunities for local benefits and understand and offset the social costs of resource extracting products. And also Precept 7 is related to the concepts of achieving intergenerational equity. Precept 8 is around ensuring the smoothing out of lumpy revenue and price volatilities, and also facilitating private sector investment to diversify the economy. And then precept 10, which I'll finish on, that companies need to commit the highest environmental, social and human rights standards to achieve a social license to operate and sustainable development. They've also developed a resource governance index as well, of which unfortunately India is on in relation to oil and gas, but however the work hasn't been done yet with relation to mining. So just turning now to some of the institutions which are looking at increasing governance in the space, we have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which looks at the amount of revenues paid by companies and what governments list as receipts. That was typically originally thought as quite an African initiative. However, now the US, Canada, Germany, the UK are all members. Also, Publish What You Pay is an institution focused on the extractive industries, transparency in payments in the extractive industries. We also see the Dodd-Frank tax. Dodd-Frank 1502 looks at conflict minerals, and a provision 1504 looks at every American company which is listed on an American exchange needs to declare any payments, any oil and gas or mining company needs to declare payments that it has made to foreign governments. Now, this act is being repealed at the moment and it's being renegotiated. The Equator Principles are a set of voluntary principles around social and environmental management of risk. And then here we have a number of institutions on the right-hand side. ICMM, which the Federation for Indian Mining is a member, is an industry body that looks at good governance in the sector and good performance. Natural Resource Governance Institute is a think tank focused on this, and the Intergovernmental Forum for Metals and Mining is a group of that convenes government officials working in this space. So the next section of this talk is really going to start to focus on the potential economic contribution from non-fuel mining. It's going to look at the sustainable element of this of non-fuel mining, and then look at providing an overview of economic contribution and present some of the constraints that have been presented. So if we define sustainability as the simultaneous pursuit of enhanced environmental quality, economic growth and social justice, the way the mining industry can contribute towards this is in the creation of mineral wealth, generating the sufficient knowledge of what is under the ground for someone to purchase, explore, develop and mine. It's to ensure mineral development occurs in an economically efficient manner, identifying the negative externalities and ensuring ultimately that these costs are included in an economic ecosystem. Then one of the key areas, ensuring surpluses from the industry are distributed fairly amongst the key stakeholder groups. And this may be current existing citizens, but also future citizens. And this comes back to that issue of social justice. And finally, ensuring benefits sustained even after mine closure through investing and revenue management in lasting industries and diversifying the economy. And these relate to these areas of these trade-offs between how much to save against how much to invest, how much to spend now, who does those savings and investing, where and what should the money be invested in. And when we start to look at the areas that this industry can contribute, we start to look at employment, economic output, import substitution, fiscal contribution, and foreign direct investment. And a lot of these factors can contribute both in a direct way, directly from the payments made by the companies, in the wages they give and in the equipment they procure, but also in an indirect way. The providers that the suppliers use in the next step down along the value chain. And also what's most interesting in this sector is around the induced impact, raising the wealth of each of the groups of society in order that they have more money to spend in other areas. And the multiples between the direct, indirect and induced are a factor of economic linkages. And we see upstream linkages through industries that supply the mining project, earth moving, logistics, life support, equipment hire, technology, but also in downstream adding these minerals to the value chain and as part of mineral beneficiation, marketing and sales, vertical integration of processing plants. And the strength of these linkages can be increased by a geographic concentration of activity, creating scale, proximity, and specialization. And a good example of this was in Louisiana in the oil and gas sector in the middle of the last decade. Louisiana is one of the world's largest success stories when it comes to linkages. Drilling occurred primarily initially on the marshland, which required barges and pilings. It then moved further down the technology chain to requiring submersible drilling rigs. And by the 1960s, the oil sector in Louisiana had generated 190,000 jobs in the Gulf waters and was generating around 4 billion annually. And so as an example of some of the backward linkages, these include piping, machinery, drilling mud, fluids, engineering. And on the forward side, we're looking at tanker service companies, refining capacity, and one of the largest concentrations of processing plants. And one of the aspects I find very interesting is that the specialism grew so much that it became an exporter of human capital overseas as well, linking other countries back to Louisiana. However, I want to return now to the Diavik mine that we talked about earlier. There are some challenges to fostering these economic linkages in the mining sector. As we see from this picture, quite often these sites are remote. We don't choose where a mine's going to be. It requires very specialized skill sets and equipment which may not be available locally, and therefore there may be some economic leakages through having to import these. Quite often it's export focused. There are boom and bust cycles and requiring large infrastructure which may need a coordination between the private and the public sector. Also, ultimately, these resources are going to be exhausted. And as a result, multiples in the mining sector tend to be lower for the extractive industries, However, in India, it must be noted this is a bit different. In India, there is a large manufacturing sector, and also there is a high population density, unlike Canada or Australia, which has large swathes of land, which can be turned into mining projects. So turning now to employment, the employment in the sector is quite often lower than expectations. ICMM estimate that each direct mining job can create 3 to 5 additional jobs, and the profile of employment changes dramatically over the course of a project. And this is some analysis we've done at Two Oceans, whereby this far left-hand side, the first number of years relates to the exploration phase, and then we see this big jump up during the construction phase. And what's really interesting about this is when we model the potential employment, the induced impact of this mining of this mine is far greater than the direct and indirect combined. Then there's this big drop off as we move into the operational phase and a slight uptick for people trying to convert this mine back to how it was before. There's a big diversity of highly skilled and unskilled labour, and mining, interestingly, offers greater unskilled opportunities than oil and gas. So this analysis is based on a study conducted by McKinsey at the end of 2014. It's actually been quite hard finding some up-to-date analysis of the non-fuel mining sector, and these numbers include the coal sector as well, which is one of the reasons why the work Brookings is doing is so important. McKinsey identified 2 scenarios. Firstly, business as usual, and a subsequent scenario which is around accelerated growth. And that accelerated growth almost adheres to the aspirations outlined in the National Minerals Policy. National Minerals Policy looks at around 10% of growth production per year. We're talking about a 7.5% growth in the accelerated growth scenario. But what McKinsey identifies is that there is a non-farm gap of around 150 million workers. And when we look at the potential contribution by 2025, and to bear in mind, to caveat this report was in 2014, so there hasn't been 5 years of accelerated growth, so we need to take these numbers with a slight pinch of salt. They estimate that around 17 million of those jobs could come from the mining industry. There's also the potential to generate substantial economic output, and here is some analysis we did at Two Oceans around looking at the direct, indirect and induced value add and income from the sector. And it's a very similar profile to the employment. Big spikes up during construction as we're paying for a lot of equipment, we're bringing in, there are a lot of workers, and then as the revenues start to uptick, when these tax losses are finally wound through the project, we're able to see this uptick throughout the operation phase of a mine. And again, McKinsey estimate that around 126 billion could contribute to the sector and around 82 billion in value add. When we start to look at the fiscal impacts, we must remember that these are non-renewable and will stop. Also, these revenues are going to be the things that facilitate intergenerational equity. There's also a time lag from exploration to receiving revenues due to carryover tax positions, and it's very heavily impacted by the mineral price at that time, and also by the stage of development of the industry. But here we see about 52 billion by 2025. The other aspect, especially in India, where it has a vibrant manufacturing sector, import substitution could be substantial from the non-fuel mining industry. And here is the difference between demand and supply in 2025 of iron ore, which the sector could play a big role. So just moving on to some of the constraints that have been identified by a number of commentators. So currently, non-fuel mining in India contributes around 1% to GDP. And we see here that there is a number of ways, number of aspects that are going to impact upon the realization. First of all, human capital. There's a large dearth of mining engineers, around 60,000 it's estimated, and specialist skills and skilled and semi-skilled labor to work on these projects. Also, there's a big challenge around geological data, which is why the aeromagnetic survey is so important. And we see this here with these numbers at the bottom of spend on exploration as a percentage of total value. India's is around 0.08, where we look at somewhere like Canada, which is 3.32. And also in this sector, we look at some challenges around the transfer of licenses between exploration to production and bringing the private sector in. Mine closure, there's some challenges around, people have argued there's some challenges around defaulting at the end of mines, and also the time taken for permitting, which is around has been around 4 years, which is far longer than these other jurisdictions we talk about. Also, when we talk about the social license to operate, India is a heavily densely populated country, and as a result, there's a challenge of land acquisition for underground mining, challenge of land acquisition and resettlement and rehabilitation. Also, we look at there's some challenges around the tax rate as well, which is some argue to be uncompetitive. So although there are some constraints that exist, the McKinsey study we've been referring to states that India's mining sector has been a success story in waiting for decades, and I couldn't agree more. So just in the final bit of this talk, I want to talk about something that I find really fascinating, and that's the trends we're seeing which will impact the sector going forward. And I have to declare a bit of a bias coming from the UK, the financial hub, and also the sustainability hub as well. I may have some availability bias in some of these trends. But the first trend I'd like to bring your attention to relates to this challenge whereby over the last decade, there has been an increase in revenue and profit in the sector based on financial performance from the top 20 mining companies. Yet we've seen a decline in market capitalization. And we've especially seen that over the last 2 or 3 years. And at this time, we're seeing a shift away from institutional investors, including the mining sector, mining stocks in their portfolio, which is becoming very challenging. Mining companies with any coal assets are being automatically disqualified for a lot of institutional investors, and the rise of sustainability and ESG funds are shifting mining stocks out of portfolios. This is part of a shift to stakeholder capitalism and also linking market cap to the court of public opinion. What I think this story doesn't tell, and there is a potential opportunity here, is that the narrative of green minerals, those minerals that are going to be critical in the green transition, lithium, copper, nickel, rare earths, all have to be mined. And they will be the facilitator of the transition, which isn't quite included in this story to date. The other factor is around increasing proximity of the consumer to the supply chain. We see here that Apple, Google, and I think Amazon are being sued by some families in the Congo over mining practices, even though they're not a mining company. We're seeing that the consumer is getting more interested in what constitutes the inputs into their devices, and as a result, there is the potential for green premiums for those companies who can demonstrate responsible practices throughout the supply chain. Additionally, we look at one of the key trends that's going to impact upon employment in the sector, Industry 4.0. The automation, the machine learning, the big data, and the data analytics that are going to change the working requirements. And here on the left-hand side, we see the world's first fully automated mine. If you look closely, there's no one in that cab. That's a mine, Syama, a gold mine in Mali owned by Resolute. And this will change the requirement for the workforce at the mine site. It will change the requirement for low-skilled workers, and it will influence the social license to operate. And lastly, there seems to be a shift to purpose. Just want to quote Mark Benioff, who is the CEO of Salesforce. He says, "Capitalism as we know it is dead. A new model of business is taking its place, driven by values, ethics, and taking care of employees, not the Milton Friedman capitalism that's just about making money." And in those slides around the market cap earlier, we're starting to see mining companies taking steps that may cost them more money and reduce their profit, but which they know will benefit them going forward. For example, you see here I put Andrew McKenzie, the outgoing CEO of BHP, is linking his bonus to carbon emissions. And also we see this declining trend in emissions intensity per tonne sold. And that may cost more, however, it's something the industry has to do in order to continue to operate. There's also seems to be a shift from the social license to operate, which has been the focus over the past decade, whereby you're trying to de-risk projects or take your projects back to how they were before. Instead, there's an argument to say, in order to achieve and go beyond the baseline and avoid climate change, we need to be doing something more. We need to be increasing our costs on certain aspects, such as carbon intensity, to allow us to continue to function. So I just want to summarize. We started off talking about the economic characteristics of the mining industry and why it's unique. We went through the process, the market, the interaction of supply and demand, an evolution in stakeholder interactions, and how the strategy has changed over time. I've also looked at what risks and challenges the mining industry presents to development, presented an overview of the resource curse hypothesis, and updated an argument about this econometric analysis, and then looked at some of the international initiatives that are ongoing. We looked at how the mining industry can make an economic contribution and highlighted some of the trade-offs required within that, and then finally looked at the global trends which are going to impact upon the development of India's mining sector: sustainability, climate change, automation, and shift to purpose over social license to operate. So I started this talk highlighting the mineral-related ages of the planet, be it the Iron Age, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Petro Age. demonstrating the central role that minerals play in the functioning of society. And I wonder if, as sustainability moves higher up the agenda, whether the next era will be the lithium age, or the rare earths age, or the copper 2.0 age. Who knows? But what we do know is that mining is essential to supplying the products we need to live, and if social, environmental, and downside risks are managed, the economic contribution from its extraction will aid in bringing people out of poverty and facilitating the green transition. Thank you.